From the women's suffrage movement to the food riots during the Great Depression to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, American citizens have rarely been shy about voicing their disapproval of the United States government. In all of these cases, those involved were fighting for better rights and treatment in their everyday lives. But what if you had no rights to fight for? Today on the Infographics show, we're looking at how the Attica prison riot really went down and how the impact continues to ripple through the American prison system. In 1971, Attica prison riot started as a rebellion against inhumane prison conditions. An organized group of prisoners detained in this New York State prison sent a manifesto to the Commissioner of Prisons that read, "The guards no longer consider to respect us as human beings." In the end, the riot would last a total of 5 days and take 39 lives. The whole truth behind this story has only recently been uncovered, as the prisoners involved were finally allowed to tell their side of the story, following a 4-decade-long cover-up by the government. First, let's look at what incited the prisoners to come together in the first place. Tensions were growing nationwide with prisons due to overcrowding, extremely limited food, access to one shower or less per week, and the absence of medical care. And life in Attica was no exception. During the late 1960s and early 70s, there was a rise in serious incidents across American prisons, including the 1970 riots in the Manhattan House of Detention and the Auburn Correctional Facility. And these events sparked a fear of more potential revolts across the country. Just before the riots began in Attica, there were over 2,250 inmates housed there, even though the prison had been designed for only 1,600, with each guard being responsible for between 60 to 120 inmates each, many of whom were violent offenders. Back to that manifesto sent by the prisoners we mentioned earlier. In the summer of 1971, the Commissioner of Prisons received a letter with a list of demands from a group of prisoners who called themselves the Attica Liberation Faction. The letter described the outright mistreatment of the Black and Hispanic majority within the prison and contained a list of 28 reforms, including improvements to the working and living conditions and a change in medical procedure. In an attempt to stop any violence or rioting before it could start, the state's reaction was to punish anyone found in possession of this document with 60 days of solitary confinement. The state's attempt to pacify the inmate population proved to be a failure when on August 22nd a Californian inmate was killed by prison guards, and the usual divisions that existed between the prisoners and various factions began to dissolve and a common solidarity formed. The next day, many prisoners wore black armbands and ate breakfast in total silence to mourn the loss of the slain California inmate. The prison took immediate note of this change in the prisoners' behavior. The guards began more seriously arming themselves and leaving behind personal items such as their wallets just in case anything jumped off while they were at work. Their fears were well placed, as it didn't take long for something to jump off. On the morning of September 9th, one inmate was able to flip the switch that controlled a cell door, releasing his friend from lockdown. A guard noticed the released prisoner and responded by locking down a group of prisoners being escorted in a passageway known as Tunnel A, trapping both prisoner and prison guard alike. The group of prisoners, perhaps afraid that they would meet the same fate that the California prisoner had met the previous day, tackled the guard and began beating him. The sounds of terror echoed through the prison, which motivated other groups of prisoners to do the same, grabbing weapons, attacking guards, and opening cells. While some prisoners hid in fear, others took this opportunity to access the prison's control center known as Times Square, shutting off all the lights and locating the prison's keys. The chaos continued to grow, with nearly 1,300 inmates now involved. Armed with bats, wooden planks, glass from broken windows, police batons, and anything else they could find, the prisoners took control of the prison. After giving up his nightstick and keys, one inmate slogged a guard named William Quinn with a large piece of wood, an injury that would lead to his death 2 days later. After the initial beating, 42 guards and civilian workers were forced out into the exercise field known as D Yard. Some prisoners later stated that the guards who had been known for treating the inmates with respect were shown the same, while the guards with a reputation for cruelty were not so lucky. The prisoners were able to quickly organize themselves, even creating their own security force and protocols, as well as a negotiation committee to handle disputes between the prisoners and the prison's administration. Frank Big Black Smith was appointed as head of security, and he's also responsible for keeping the hostages and the observers safe while tensions were high. The next 2 days were filled with intense negotiations between the prisoners and officials outside the walls. Better sanitation, higher quality food, more visitation rights, and an end to beating by the guards were the first demands brought to the table by the prisoners in exchange for letting the hostages free. Negotiating on the other side was Commissioner of Prisons Russell Oswald, along with famed attorney William Kunstler, as well as New York Times reporter Tom Wicker, to both assist with negotiations as well as broadcast the event to the public. Despite the high profile of the incident, the governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, did not make an appearance. Some early miscommunication from Oswald led to distrust from the prisoners, and they soon after refused direct talks with him. While negotiations were in full swing, the inmate leaders like Frank Smith were giving empowering speeches to boost morale and motivate the prisoners. The prisoners dug moats, turned back on the electric fences, doused the surrounding areas with gasoline, prepared weapons, further secured Times Square, and lit up dark hallways in preparation for when the state finally moved in. When it seemed that the negotiations were hitting a dead end, the prisoners knew they would be forced to make a bold move. Oswald gave the prisoners a final ultimatum which they rejected, and responded by taking 8 hostages out to the catwalk of the prison where they threatened them with knives. Following this bold rejection on September 13th, the 5th day of rioting, with the state now being made aware of the death of prison guard Quinn, Governor Rockefeller, with President Nixon's support, ordered the storming and recapture of the prison. 15 minutes after the order, a National Guard helicopter flew over the prison firing tear gas canisters meant to disorient the rioters. Shortly after, roughly 550 uniformed New York State police officers prepared to retake the prison. They were joined by hundreds of sheriffs, deputies, and police from neighboring counties who had come to support the working officers, though many have claimed that they were mostly there to take revenge. Many of the officers then removed their identification before entering the prison, which allowed them to act with impunity and be exempt from any punishment, as they would be able to remain unidentified without their badges. Many of those officers brought weapons of their own from home, with one group of officers using .270 caliber rifles, which utilize unjacketed bullets, a kind of ammunition that causes such enormous damage to human flesh that it was banned by the Geneva Convention. Decades later, when the prisoners were able to share their side of the story, journalist Heather Ann Thompson wrote about the horror stories relayed by the surviving prisoners in a Pulitzer Prize-winning account that described the police storming the prison, shooting ferociously, and with no real targets or plan at all. This was followed by an hour of beatings and torture, with police knocking prisoners' heads together, hitting people with the butt of their rifles, and then shooting them, putting the barrel of the gun in their mouths of the prisoners just for laughs, or forcing them to strip naked. In one specific instance, a prisoner was shot in the abdomen, told to walk, and when he couldn't, he was killed. After the bloodbath came to an end, the state once again had control of the prison. A grand total of 128 men had been shot, with 29 prisoners and 9 hostages lying dead. This was not the end of the abuse for prisoners, as bizarre work methods like forcing them to clean the prison naked and physical harm lasted for weeks following the raid. According to one source, Attica's prison doctor, Dr. Paul Sternberg, exacted his own form of revenge, often using racial slurs and refusing to treat many of the prisoners' injuries, or making them wait weeks for treatment. But perhaps the most bizarre part of the entire ordeal was the cover-up that would follow. The state took great pains in trying to obfuscate what actually happened in the retaking of Attica's D Yard on September 13th. Following the hour-long battle to take the prison, Walter Dunbar, the Executive Deputy Commissioner of New York's Department of Correctional Services, had reported to the public that the guards who had been kept as hostages were killed by the prisoners, when in fact they had been killed by law enforcement, caught in the crossfire during the assault. He further claimed to have witnessed an inmate performing a castration on a guard before killing him, to further vilify the inmates and strengthen his cover-up. An official Attica investigation was called by Governor Rockefeller and undertaken by the New York State Police and its Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and strongly focused on the wrongdoings of the inmates, completely disregarding the role played by law enforcement either prior to or during the riot. The state continues to push this side of the story, even going so far as to pressure medical examiner John Edlin to falsify death records, an order he refused. He would be regarded as a hero by many when he revealed publicly that many of the victims had died of gunshot wounds inflicted by police, not the prisoners. Although this news surfaced, not a single officer or civilian involved was indicted or convicted of any crimes. Governor Rockefeller and President Nixon were able to sell the case to the public that monstrous battle was warranted, and eventually 62 inmates would be indicted for more than 1,200 criminal acts. The blame for the riot and its aftermath placed squarely at their feet. However, in 1974, after more reports of the incident came to light, the new governor of New York, Hugh Carey, sought to bring an end to the whole affair by ending any and all criminal charges related to the riot. He was successful in pardoning every Attica prisoner for cases relating to the riots, and offered restitution to victims of the crimes committed by the authorities before, during, and after the riot. In the year 2000, the dean of NYU's law school held meetings to discuss and investigate the Attica revolt. The final report described the details of the gruesome conditions and race-based terror prisoners were subjected to in the years prior to the revolt, and was strongly critical of how law enforcement handled the crisis. Also in 2000, the state of New York finally settled a civil suit brought by inmates for a total of $12 million in damages for the use of excessive force, though by then many of the potential claimants were dead, with many more uninterested or unable to be located. Frank Big Black Smith, the motivational leader of the prisoners who received some of the worst treatment after the riot, who was subjected to being burned, assaulted, humiliated, and threatened, spent the rest of his days living in New York City and working as a paralegal, dedicating himself to prisoners' rights cases until his death in 2004. The Attica prison riot serves as a reminder of what can happen when a failed prison system is combined with the systemic abuse of human rights. While some sort of justice has been served, the riot will forever be another reminder of why you shouldn't always believe what the authorities tell you, but rather exercise your right to research and demand what's right. Do you believe the prisoners deserved their initial punishment, or that the police officers deserve to be charged for their actions? We would love to know what you think. Let us know in the comments. Also, be sure to check out our other video, What Happens in the H Unit at a Federal Supermax Prison. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.